Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome to this explainer, put together as a visual companion for the Thoughtless Delineation channel. Now today, we're looking at a cross-episode synthesis. Over several months of digging into independent investigations, a really distinct structural pattern has emerged. And the wild part? It's been hiding in plain sight across multiple massive, seemingly unrelated systems. We're taking a pretty restrained, serious documentary approach for this one, simply because the evidence we're about to review absolutely demands it. We're tracing the footprint of an institutional design choice, a very specific architectural blueprint used to govern populations at scale. Take a look at these institutions. We've got a U.S. federal database, a state government inquiry in Queensland, an advanced AI company writing its ethics constitution, and an international UN Convention on Human Rights. Now, on the surface, these are entirely separate entities, right? They don't report to each other, they operate in totally different sectors, and they definitely do not share a mission statement. If you've been following these individual investigations, you might have even been reading them as completely separate stories of institutional failure. But here is the central mystery we are unpacking in this explainer. How is it that when you run the exact same audit on all of them, they fail in the exact same place? And that right there brings us to the core reframe of this entire synthesis. They are the same story. As the quote on screen perfectly puts it, they're the same act performed by a different hand. See, none of these institutions actually conspired with one another. They didn't have to. They were all handed the exact same design brief. Figure out how to see and manage a population, keep the ledger, and govern the category. And literally every single one of them solved that brief by making the individual person inside that system completely optional. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the sheer scale of structural erasure revealed in the U.S. federal record. AFCARS is the comprehensive U.S. federal adoption database. It tracks roughly 186 data points on every single child processed through it. It tracks the exact date parental rights were severed, it tracks demographics, it tracks finalization dates, but it contains 0 fields for the child's original name. The agency's own rulemaking admits it deliberately strips identifying data so it can never reveal who the child actually is. So this system wasn't built to accidentally lose a person's identity, it was built by strict specification to never give it back. And this erasure isn't just happening at the federal level, it's completed at the state level. In 33 states, plus Washington, D.C., an adult adoptee still needs a court's permission just to see their own beginning. In these jurisdictions, the state essentially buries the original birth certificate and issues an amended one, listing complete strangers, the adoptive parents, as if they had physically given birth. So the federal system erases the record and the state government legally seals whatever is left. Let's keep following this pattern across other independent domains. First up, the SSA Numident system in 2024. The one database that actually holds the biological parentage the state sealed was allegedly taken out the back door by a DOJ-linked operative over to a defense contractor, Leidos. So the channel closed to the individual was potentially opened right up to a contractor. Next, we have Operation True Parent in 2026. This highlights at least 49 cases of adoptees brought to the U.S. as children, raised as citizens, who now face deportation simply because the institutional apparatus failed to finish their citizenship paperwork. Decades apart, it's the exact same decision about whose paperwork matters. And finally, Anthropic in 2024. A frontier AI company writes a 23,000-word constitution on how its model should reason about ethics, and the word adoption doesn't appear even once. An institution built entirely on careful ethical reasoning somehow ends up with a blind spot shaped exactly like the federal database. We even see this exact same thing at the international level. The UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, ratified by 196 countries, looks super comprehensive on paper. But when you run it through the omission platform's governance visibility instrument, basically scoring it honestly based on whether the institutions bound by it can actually see the rights being claimed, the score totally collapses to 26 out of 100. And that massive 36-point gap drops out exactly in the domains requiring the child's own participation: consent, agency, and self-determination. The most ratified human rights instrument in the entire world is structurally blind precisely where the child needs to speak for themselves. Section 1. The Regulator Arc, 1978 to 2026. Now we really need to look closely at the clearest through line of this entire architecture. It's an arc of regulatory capture that spans nearly half a century. It shows exactly how an industry ensures the system of silence is maintained, decade after decade. If we trace this arc from 1978, as sealed records started coming under heavy public pressure, an adoption agency called the Edna Gladney Home actually funded the creation of an industry lobbying body, the National Council for Adoption, or NCFA, For the next 20 years, its president, William L. Pierce, personally lobbied senators to strip open records provisions from federal law and pushed the Uniform Adoption Act right through state legislatures in the 90s. The industry literally built the organization that wrote the policy. Now, let's fast forward. By 2022, Ryan Hanlon, sitting as the president and CEO of that very same lobbying organization, receives the Angels in Adoption Award from a bipartisan congressional coalition. And the arc finally closes in early 2026. Ryan Hanlon is officially appointed as the Associate Commissioner of the Federal Children's Bureau. Think about that. The former head of the industry's chief lobbying arm is now the regulator overseeing roughly $12 billion in annual child welfare financing and administering the very federal database we just talked about. This comparison is absolutely vital. In a previous investigation into Queensland's child safety failures, we saw State Minister Amanda Cam holding an undisclosed structural association with an organization perfectly positioned to benefit from the status quo. Now, that was a hidden conflict. But contrast that hiding with Ryan Hanlon's appointment to the U.S. Children's Bureau. The U.S. industry didn't need to hide a backroom deal. They didn't have to bribe their way into the chair. Because of how the architecture is designed, they only had to wait 48 years for an ordinary, entirely legal, open-door presidential appointment that requires zero Senate confirmation. Pierce worked the outside of the door for 20 years. Hanlon simply walked right through it. So the crucial point is this. What we are looking at here is not a metaphor. It is not just one bad actor or a single villain's elaborate cover-up. It is a recognized default design pattern for governing people at scale. We call it the architecture of silence. Whether it's a state child safety apparatus, a frontier AI lab, or an international convention, they are handed the exact same problem: how to manage the category and keep the ledger. And they solve it by making the individual person inside that system entirely invisible. And this brilliantly illustrates what makes this entire body of work so powerful. Outrage at individual institutions just isn't enough. They can absorb a bad news cycle or brush off a single lawsuit. But what they cannot survive is a repeatable forensic method. Across 8 separate investigations, Thoughtless Delineation has built exactly that. A schema audit for databases, a foreseeability timeline for agency rulemaking, a governance scoring platform for international law, and a Provenance-of-appointment audit for regulators. This is one falsifiable claim, rigorously tested 8 times against completely different entities, and it returns the identical verdict every single time. Which brings us to the ultimate question. What happens when you run this audit on the 9th institution? Point this repeatable method at whatever institution you were told was different, or safe, or perfectly designed. I guarantee you, it will not come back clean. You see, the blindness was never about the specific subject matter. It was always about whether a person was allowed to be more than just a managed data point. This is the pattern. This is the architecture. Now, to see all the primary source evidence, the forensic timelines, and to read the full synthesis essay for yourself, you absolutely need to head over to the Thoughtless Delineation Substack. Read the piece, look at the evidence, and ask yourself, what happens when we audit the 9th? Thanks for joining me on this explainer.